Shaming and silence. Shame and silence, two mechanisms that work together to control, silence, and suppress. In our society, where power structures shape the narratives we are allowed to tell, shaming is not just a personal attack. It is a deliberate, calculated method of control. Silence is not simply the absence of speech, it is the consequence of fear, trauma, and power. In this video essay, I will explore how shaming and silence are intricately tied to power dynamics in our society. These acts work together to uphold systems of control, from fear-driven silence in academic spaces to the gendered violence that silences victims, to the amplification of shame in the digital age. Rape culture is a pervasive issue that exists on a continuum, influencing our perceptions and behavior in subtle and overt ways. For instance, many people today struggle to even identify what constitutes sexual assault, which highlights the lack of conversations around defining and understanding it. This silence perpetuates harmful behaviors, particularly when individuals who have engaged in borderline acts of sexual violence are not confronted or held accountable. House parties, often run by young men, epitomize this power imbalance. These house parties are expected to be a defining experience of university life, with older generations reinforcing their importance. Yet the dynamics of these parties perpetuate a system where men hold authority, determining women's status and worth. Historically, women have been viewed as property, and social practices like this continue to affirm that idea. Misogyny, the dislike of women paired with their objectification for male satisfaction, remains embedded in such environments. Women who refuse to conform to these norms or who criticize them are often pressured to stay silent or risk being labeled mean-spirited. On university campuses, this creates a climate where individuals are left to navigate complex expectations about self-worth and social value. For example, research shows that while many women find catcalling degrading and fear it as a precursor to violence, some may momentarily interpret it as affirming. The mixed emotions come from living in a culture that ties women's worth to their sexual appeal. This can lead to conflicted feelings, as the same behavior that makes someone feel objectified also serves as a temporary validation of their attractiveness. Another critical issue is the tendency to individualize sexual violence. While it is essential to acknowledge and validate the bravery of survivors in sharing their stories, stopping at individual cases ignores the larger systemic and cultural forces that enable sexual violence. Without addressing the pervasive norms and structures that uphold rape culture, societal change remains elusive. Fear and silence, the mechanisms of control. Fear is often the invisible force behind silence. In environments where authority figures hold considerable power, the fear of retaliation or career harm keeps many individuals quiet. Fear manifests in two forms of silence: defensive silence, where individuals choose silence to avoid negative consequences, and quiescent silence, a more instinctive response rooted in fear. The intensity of fear influences the type of silence. High-intensity fear leads to automatic silence, while lower-intensity fear creates more deliberate silence. This fear can stem from authority figures, creating a hierarchy that discourages speaking out. Even when authority isn't directly threatening, ingrained fear leads to silence as a means of protection. Verbal and physical cues from those in power can heighten this fear when approached, ensuring that silence persists, even in perceived safer environments. Silence, rooted in evolutionary instincts, becomes a protective response that maintains power dynamics. Gendered violence and silence. One of the most harmful ways silence operates is in response to gendered violence. Women in particular are often subjected to slut-shaming, a tactic used to silence their voices, especially when speaking about sexual violence. The trauma from slut-shaming leads to concealing experiences to avoid judgment or harm. Women who have suffered childhood trauma are especially vulnerable, as their shame is deeply internalized. Society encourages strict femininity, and this discourages disclosures of violence. Non-heterosexual youth, particularly bisexual and lesbian individuals, face compounded shame because of their sexual orientation, and this can further deepen their silence. Gender violence is often hidden to protect the survivor from dishonor and societal judgment. Toxic shame, which is known as internalized feelings of inadequacy, can prevent disclosure of trauma. Whether out of fear of blame or disbelief, shame keeps victims silent, reinforcing harmful societal norms. The online shaming phenomenon. In the digital age, shaming has found a new venue: online platforms. People often engage in online shaming as a form of moral justification, positioning themselves as morally superior while distancing themselves from guilt. Behavioral traits like narcissism or a lack of empathy can increase involvement in shaming. Emotional detachment allows for individuals to view others as deserving of punishment, amplifying the cycle. The anonymity of the digital space heightens these behaviors, making people more likely to shame without facing immediate consequences. In this sense, online shaming becomes not just a personal act, but a societal one, reinforced by digital spaces where consequences are minimized and moral detachment is easier to sustain. Shaming as a tool for reinforcing power structures. Shaming is deeply tied to societal power structures. Misogynistic language, like calling a woman a slut or the B word, enforces traditional gender roles and silences women who challenge societal expectations. When women act outside these norms, they are punished through harassment. This creates a culture of fear, where women withdraw from public spaces or silence themselves to avoid further harm. For women of color, this intersection of racial and gender discrimination compounds the abuse, silencing them further. Shaming becomes a tool to maintain patriarchal structures, controlling behavior. It enforces the status quo, ensuring that women stay within the confines of their traditional roles and expectations. The consequences of shaming women in gender studies. Women in gender studies as a discipline is well aware of the shame often attached to its programs and the material it covers. We live in a time where programs like economics takes on a different kind of primary focus, meaning that unless we can prove that a faculty or program leads directly to a specific job, it is often dismissed as having no purpose. Of course, this is not true. What happens instead is that this mindset shortens and narrows the parameters of our thinking, limiting the ways our brains can be challenged and pushed in new directions. In academia, gender studies programs are often marginalized, reinforcing societal perceptions of gender studies as inferior. Faculty in these fields face career challenges, furthering the stigma that limits the discipline's impact on social change. The stigma surrounding gender studies not only limits professional growth, but it also impedes progress on critical issues like gender inequality. Women who deviate from traditional gender norms, whether in career or family life, face shame or gender-based violence, which keeps them silent. Yet in gender studies, we find a critique of shame. While shame is used to reinforce power, it can also be mobilized to challenge injustice, as feminist activism has shown. Shame, when critically examined, can become a powerful tool for resistance. Shaming and silence are tools of control. They protect power structures, but they are not invincible. By understanding these mechanisms, we can begin to dismantle the systems that use them to maintain oppression and work towards a world where voices are heard and shame is no longer a tool of silence. Silence is not the absence of voice, it is the product of fear. Shaming is not the expression of morality, it is a tool to maintain power. And only when we dismantle these tools can we begin to build a society where all voices are heard.